Turn the lights down and get comfortable. Tonight's story begins in the dark. Before we start, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what kind of stories keep you up at night.
The air in the Black Ridge Basin doesn't just feel cold, it feels heavy, like a wet wool blanket pressed against your face that smells of ancient pine sap and something metallic, almost like iron shavings left to rust in a bucket of rainwater. I pulled my collar up, the stiff fabric of my new ranger uniform chafing against my neck, a sensation I'm still not used to after only 3 weeks on the job. My boots crunched into the layer of decaying leaves and half-frozen mud, a sound that seemed to echo much further than it should in the dense undergrowth where the late fall fog hangs like tattered gray curtains. I took this job because I wanted the silence of the wilderness to drown out the constant, vibrating hum of the city that made my teeth ache for years. But out here, the silence isn't empty. It's a physical presence that pushes against your eardrums. I checked my GPS, the screen glowing a sickly green against the deepening shadows of the hemlocks, noting that I was 3 miles from the last known sighting of the missing hiker, a man named Samuel Vance, who had disappeared 48 hours ago. My radio crackled once, a sharp burst of white noise that sounded like someone tearing a sheet of parchment right next to my ear, making me jump and tighten my grip on the heavy mag light in my left hand. There was no voice, just the hiss of the atmosphere and a faint rhythmic clicking that I tried to convince myself was just interference from the ridge's mineral deposits. The smell of ozone began to mix with the scent of rotting wood as I stepped over a fallen trunk, its bark slick and peeling like dead skin. I could feel the dampness seeping through my gloves, making my fingers feel numb and sluggish as I adjusted the heavy gear belt digging into my hips. I stopped for a moment to listen, hearing nothing but the distant, mournful creak of 2 trees rubbing together in the wind, a sound so much like a human moan that I had to close my eyes and breathe through my nose until my heart rate slowed. I remember thinking that this was exactly what I asked for, isolation and purpose. But as the light faded into a bruised purple hue, the forest felt less like a sanctuary and more like a mouth that was slowly closing. I panned my light across the trail, the beam catching the silvered eyes of a deer that didn't run. It just stood there in the thicket, its silhouette looking slightly too tall, its neck craned at an angle that felt biologically impossible, watching me with a stillness that made the hair on my arms stand up. I moved past it quickly, the smell of wet animal musk following me for 100 yards, and I didn't look back, even when I heard the distinct sound of something heavy stepping into the brush behind me. By the time I reached the mouth of the switchbacks leading up toward the fire lookout, the moon was a pale, smudged thumbprint behind the clouds, providing just enough light to see that the mist had turned into a fine, freezing drizzle. I could taste the dampness on my tongue, a flavor of cold stone and old earth that seemed to coat the back of my throat with every breath I took. My flashlight beam was starting to bounce off the suspended water droplets in the air, creating a wall of white glare that forced me to keep my eyes glued to the narrow, treacherous path where the dirt had turned into a slurry of gray mud. I've always found peace in the idea of being the only person for miles, a lone sentinel in a world of green and brown, which is why I left a high-paying logistics career to stand in a freezing forest at midnight. But the isolation was starting to feel heavy, like a pressure in my chest that wouldn't let me take a full breath. I heard a whistle then, a long, low note that started high and dipped down into a trill, coming from somewhere deep in the ravine to my left. It sounded human, but it was too sustained, too perfect, like a recording played on a loop. I stopped, my thumb hovering over the transmit button on my radio, waiting for it to repeat. But the only sound that followed was the patter of sleet hitting the hood of my jacket. I noticed a set of tracks near a cluster of mountain laurel, but they weren't the lugged soles of a hiking boot or the pointed hooves of a deer. They were long, narrow depressions in the mud, shaped vaguely like a foot, but with no distinct toes and a heel that sank 4 inches deep into the frozen ground. I knelt down, the cold of the earth radiating through the knees of my trousers, and smelled something sharp and sour, like vinegar mixed with scorched hair. It was a scent that didn't belong in the late fall woods, an intrusive chemical odor that made my eyes water. As I stood up, I caught a flicker of movement at the very edge of my vision, a shadow that seemed to detach itself from the trunk of a massive oak tree and slide behind a rock. When I swung my light toward it, there was nothing but the rock, but the shadow it cast didn't match its shape. The shadow was long and spindly, with limbs that looked like knotted branches reaching out toward the trail. I told myself it was just the angle of the moon, a trick of the fog and my own exhaustion, but my pulse was drumming a frantic rhythm in my fingertips, and the radio in its holster felt like it was vibrating against my ribs, though no one was calling. I started walking again, faster this time, the sound of my own breathing loud and ragged in the stillness of the trees.
The trail narrowed as I climbed, the rock face on my right oozing a black, slimy moisture that smelled of sulfur and wet coal, while the drop-off to my left was a void of impenetrable darkness. I reached a small clearing where an old trail marker had been snapped in half, the wood splintered and raw as if something had tried to bite through it. I touched the jagged edge, the splinters catching on my damp gloves, and felt a strange, rhythmic thumping through the soles of my boots, a vibration that felt like a giant heart beating somewhere deep beneath the crust of the earth. I thought about Samuel Vance, wondering if he was out here in the dark, feeling the same sense of being hemmed in by the shadows. I joined the service to find people, to be the one who brings the lost back to the light, but in this moment, the light from my mag light felt pathetically small against the vast, oppressive weight of the forest. My radio hissed to life again, but this time there was a sound behind the static, a soft, wet, squelching noise, followed by a voice that sounded exactly like my own. It said my name, Miller, in a tone that was perfectly flat, devoid of any inflection or emotion, just a recording of my own voice played back at me. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard it felt like it would bruise. I haven't spoken into the radio in over an hour, so there was no way for it to have captured my voice. I pressed the talk button, my voice trembling as I asked for the caller to identify themselves, but the only response was that same whistling trill from the ravine, louder now and much closer. I looked up toward the ridge and saw a figure standing on a granite outcropping about 50 yards above me. It was silhouetted against the gray sky, a tall, thin shape that didn't seem to have a head, just a long, tapering neck that swayed slowly from side to side, like a blade of grass in a breeze. I blinked, and the figure was gone, replaced by the jagged shape of a lightning-scarred pine tree that I could have sworn wasn't there a second ago. The smell of rot grew stronger, a cloying, sweet stench of decaying meat that seemed to rise from the very ground beneath my feet. I felt a sudden sharp pressure in my ears, the way they pop when you change altitude too fast, and for a second, all the sound in the woods vanished. The wind, the sleet, my own breathing, leaving me in a vacuum of absolute, terrifying silence. Then the sound of a single heavy footstep landed right behind me, the vibration traveling up my spine like an electric shock. I spun around, my light cutting a frantic arc through the mist, but the trail behind me was empty, just the wet rocks and the skeletal branches of the mountain laurel shivering in the wind. The silence broke with the sound of a distant knock, a hollow thud of wood on wood that echoed from 3 different directions at once. I wiped the condensation from my forehead with the back of my hand, my skin feeling clammy and cold, the numbness in my fingers making it hard to maintain a grip on my light. I remembered my training, the instructors telling us that the woods can play tricks on your mind, that isolation breeds hallucinations,
but the smell of ozone and wet iron was too real, too physical to be a dream. I started toward the old fire tower, thinking that the elevation would give me a better vantage point and maybe a clearer radio signal. As I walked, I noticed that the trees were different here. Their bark was charred and blackened, though there had been no fires in this sector for decades, and the branches were twisted into shapes that looked like grasping hands. I stepped over a pile of what I thought were bleached branches, only to realize upon closer inspection that they were old, weather-beaten pieces of park ranger equipment. A cracked helmet, a rusted belt buckle, and a radio casing that had been crushed flat as if a heavy weight had stepped on it. There were no bones, just the gear half swallowed by the moss and the mud. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me, the scent of the wet earth turning sour and metallic in my nose. I became a ranger because I wanted to protect this place, to be a steward of the wild. But the wild here felt hostile, like a body trying to white cell an infection. I heard a voice then, coming from a cluster of thick pines to my right, calling out for help. It was Samuel Vance's voice. I recognized it from the emergency briefing tapes. But the cadence was wrong. It was too fast. The words, "Help me, please, someone help me," running together into a single breathless string of sounds that didn't pause for air. I shone my light into the pines, the beams catching the glint of something pale and smooth moving between the trunks. But it wasn't a man. It was something white and hairless, with limbs that were far too long, dragging itself through the brush with a silent, fluid grace that no human could mimic. I backed away, my boots slipping on the slick mud, the pressure in my chest tightening until I could only take shallow, ragged eps of the freezing air.
I didn't run because running in these woods at night is a death sentence, but I moved with a frantic, purposeful stride that made my lungs burn with the taste of cold sap and old rot. Every time I looked over my shoulder, the shadows seemed to have shifted, the trees closing in behind me as if the forest were a living thing that was slowly sealing the path. The fire tower finally appeared through the fog, a skeletal structure of rusted iron and gray wood that looked like it was leaning at an impossible angle against the dark sky. I reached the base of the stairs, my hand trembling as I gripped the cold, damp railing, the metal vibrating with a low-frequency hum that I could feel in the marrow of my bones. I started to climb, the wooden steps creaking under my weight, each sound feeling like a gunshot in the oppressive stillness of the basin. Halfway up, I stopped and looked down, my light catching a movement at the base of the tower. There was a silhouette there, standing exactly where I had been standing moments ago. It was shaped like a man in a ranger's uniform, but the proportions were all wrong. The torso was too long, the arms reached down past the knees, and the head was tilted so far to the side that it was resting on its own shoulder. It didn't have a face, just a smooth, pale surface that reflected my flashlight beam like a piece of polished bone. It began to climb the stairs, but it didn't use its feet. It moved with a hitching, mechanical motion, its limbs snapping into place with the sound of breaking dry wood. I scrambled up the remaining steps, my breath coming in frantic gasps that puffed white in the freezing air, the smell of wet iron and ozone becoming so thick I could almost chew it. I reached the trap door at a lookout cabin and heaved it open, throwing myself inside and slamming it shut, the heavy iron bolt sliding home with a finality that offered very little comfort. I sat on the floor in the dark, my back against the door, listening to those snapping wooden movements coming up the stairs, one slow, deliberate step at a time. I became a ranger to find the truth of the world, away from the lies of the city. But as I sat there in the dark, I realized that some truths are meant to stay buried under the leaves and the cold, damp earth of the deep woods.
Inside the lookout cabin, the air was even colder than the forest outside, smelling of stale coffee, old paper, and a faint, lingering scent of human sweat that was rapidly being overtaken by the smell of wet rot coming from beneath the floorboards.
I didn't dare turn on the overhead light, keeping my mag light off as I huddled in the corner, the only illumination coming from the occasional flash of distant lightning that turned the world outside into a strobing black and white nightmare. I could hear the thing outside the door now, a soft, wet, snuffling sound like a dog smelling for a treat, followed by the sound of my own voice again, whispering from the other side of the wood. "It's cold out here, Miller," it said, the imitation so perfect it made my skin crawl. "Let me in. It's so cold I can't feel my hands." I pressed my hands over my ears, my fingers numb and vibrating from the cold metal of the cabin's walls, trying to shut out the sound of my own plea. I looked around the small room, my eyes adjusting to the gloom, and saw a logbook sitting on the desk. I crawled toward it, the floorboards groaning under my knees, and flicked my light on for a split second. The last entry wasn't written in ink, it was scratched into the paper with something sharp, the letters jagged and frantic. It didn't say anything about Samuel Vance or weather reports. It just said, "It sounds like me," over and over again, until the lead of the pencil had snapped and torn through the page. I felt a drop of something cold and viscous hit the back of my neck, and I looked up. The ceiling of the cabin was covered in a dark, pulsing moss that hadn't been there when I first looked, a growth that smelled of animal musk and stagnant water. It was dripping a thick, clear fluid that sizzled slightly when it hit the wooden floor. I realized then that the fire tower wasn't a refuge, it was a trap, a tall iron finger pointing at the sky to draw in anything looking for a way out. The scratching at the door stopped, replaced by a rhythmic knocking on the glass of the windows, all four sides of the cabin at once, as if a dozen people were standing on the narrow catwalk outside, 30 feet above the ground. I gripped my radio, the plastic casing slick with my own cold sweat, and heard a faint, distant signal through the static. Not a voice, but the sound of someone crying, a jagged, heartbroken sound that I realized with a jolt of pure terror was exactly how I sounded when I was a child. The sound of my own childhood crying coming through the radio was a jagged blade that cut through my remaining composure, a sound I hadn't heard since the night my father walked out into the Michigan snow and never came back, which was the real reason I sought the shelter of the pines, to find the things that disappear. I clutched the radio to my chest, the cold plastic vibrating against my ribs like a trapped bird, while the knocking on the glass outside reached a fever pitch, a frantic, rhythmic drumming that made the entire lookout cabin shudder on its iron legs. I could feel the pressure in my ears mounting, a dense, heavy weight that made it feel as though I were sinking to the bottom of a dark lake. The smell of wet iron and ozone was so thick now that I could feel a metallic film coating my teeth, and the air in the room seemed to shimmer with a faint greenish luminescence. I forced myself to look toward the door, where the iron bolt was beginning to groan under a pressure that wasn't coming from a push, but from a pull, as if the wood itself were being sucked out into the night. "Miller, please, it's me, Samuel," the voice outside said, changing mid-sentence from my own voice to a deep, gravelly baritone that matched the description of the missing hiker. Yet the cadence remained that same unnatural, breathless loop. I reached for my heavy maglite, the metal so cold it felt like it was fused to the skin of my palm, and I flicked the beam toward the window. For a fraction of a second, the light caught a reflection that wasn't mine, a face pressed against the glass that was nothing more than a stretched, translucent membrane over a skull with too many teeth and eyes that were positioned on the sides of the head like a shark's. It didn't blink, it just stared, its pupils dilating until they swallowed the iris whole. I recoiled, my boots slipping on the slick, mossy floor, and I felt the damp, cold pressure of the ceiling moss brushing against the crown of my head, its tendrils healing like tiny, questing fingers searching for a grip. The radio erupted into a high-pitched squeal that sounded like a woman screaming in a tunnel,
a sound that seemed to vibrate the very glass in the window frames. I knew then that I couldn't stay in the tower. It was no longer a height of safety, but a pedestal for whatever was circling in the dark, a beacon that had guided me exactly where it wanted me to be. I grabbed my pack, the straps feeling like lead weights on my shoulders, and I prepared to face the stairs again, knowing that the thing with the snapping wooden joints was waiting just on the other side of that thin wooden door.
I threw the bolt and kicked the trapdoor open, not waiting for the thing to react as I lunged out onto the catwalk, the freezing rain hitting my face like needles of ice. The figure I had seen climbing the stairs was gone, but the air on the catwalk was thick with the scent of human breath, warm, moist, and smelling of peppermint and decay, as if someone were standing right behind me, whispering into the nape of my neck. I didn't turn around. I just vaulted over the railing onto the first flight of stairs, my boots thudding against the wet wood with a sound that felt dangerously loud in the hollow basin. As I descended, I could hear the snapping sounds following me, not from the stairs, but from the iron support beams themselves, as if something were descending the tower by crawling down the vertical struts. I hit the ground running, my light swinging wildly, catching glimpses of the forest that seemed to have transformed in the hour I was trapped. The trail was gone, replaced by a maze of thorns and blackened briars that moved with a slow, serpentine undulation. I realized I was being funneled away from the ridge and back down toward the creek bed, where the fog was so dense it looked like a solid wall of gray stone. I took this job because I thought I could handle the isolation, that I was stronger than the loneliness that broke my mother. But as the trees closed in around me, I felt small and insignificant, a stray atom in a chaotic, hungry universe. I heard a whistle again, the same trill from before, but this time it was answered by another whistle from the opposite direction, and then another, until the woods were filled with a discordant symphony of mimicry. The smell of wet animal musk intensified, mixing with a sudden sharp odor of wood smoke that felt out of place in the damp, freezing night. I saw a light ahead, a faint, flickering orange glow that looked like a campfire, and for a moment hope flared in my chest like a match. I ran toward it, my breath hitching in my throat, but as I got closer, I saw that the light wasn't coming from a fire. It was coming from a circle of old, rotted park ranger jackets, all suspended from the branches of a willow tree, their fabric glowing with a soft bioluminescent rot that pulsed in time with the thumping I had felt in the earth. There was no warmth there, only a cold, sickly radiance that showed the ground beneath the tree was littered with thousands of small white bones, all polished smooth and arranged in neat concentric circles.
The sight of the glowing jackets and the bone circles made my stomach lurch, a cold wave of bile rising in my throat as I realized these weren't the remains of hikers, but a collection, a curated display of everything that had ever tried to police these woods. I backed away from the willow tree, my light catching the silvered glint of a badge pinned to one of the hanging sleeves, a badge that bore the same serial number prefix as mine. I felt a sudden sharp pain in my chest, a pressure that felt like a heavy hand was squeezing my lungs, making it impossible to draw in more than a shallow gasp of the freezing, ozone-rich air. I remember my father saying that the woods don't take what they can't use, and looking at the neat rows of bones, I understood that I was being measured for a place in this architecture. The whistling had stopped, replaced by a low, vibrating hum that seemed to be coming from the trees themselves, a sound that made the water in the nearby creek dance in strange, geometric patterns. I turned to run, but my feet felt heavy, as if the mud were reaching up to hold me in place, the cold dampness of the earth seeping through the leather of my boots and turning my toes into blocks of ice. I heard a branch snap behind me, and when I spun around, I saw a silhouette that looked exactly like Samuel Vance, standing 20 feet away in the shadows of the hemlocks. He was wearing the same red flannel shirt from the missing person flyer, but the shirt was fused to his skin, the fabric rippling as if there was something moving underneath it, something with too many joints. "Miller," he said, his voice a perfect replica of the recording I had heard earlier. "You forgot your radio." He held out a hand, and I saw that his fingers were nearly a foot long, tapering into fine needle-like points that twitched with a life of their own. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just turned and plunged into the thick growth, the thorns tearing at my uniform and scratching my face, the smell of wet iron and rot following me like a physical shroud. I could hear him behind me, not running, but moving with that same hitching, mechanical stride, the sound of snapping wood echoing through the dark as he matched my pace with terrifying ease. I realized then that I wasn't being chased, I was being herded, driven towards something deeper in the basin where the shadows never lifted, and the air was thick with the breath of the ancient and the hungry. My flight through the brush felt like a fever dream, the world reduced to the narrow circle of my flashlight and the agonizing rhythm of my own heartbeat. I reached the edge of the creek, the water black and sluggish, reflecting the moonless sky like a sheet of obsidian. I stepped into the water, the cold hitting my ankles like a physical blow, the current pulling at my legs with a strength that felt intentional. I waded across, the smell of stagnant water and wet coal filling my nose, and as I reached the other side, I looked back. The figure of Samuel Vance was standing at the water's edge, but it wasn't standing on the ground. It was hovering a few inches above the mud, its long needle fingers trailing in the water like fishing lines. It didn't cross the creek, but it tilted its head at that same impossible angle, and I heard my mother's voice calling my name from its throat, a soft, crooning lullaby that I hadn't heard in 20 years. The sound filled me with a hollow, aching dread, a sense of loss so profound it felt like my ribs were being pulled apart. I scrambled up the bank, my hands digging into the cold, slimy clay, and found myself on a path that hadn't been on any of my maps, a trail of crushed white stone that shimmered with a faint inner light. I followed it because I had no other choice, the forest on either side becoming a wall of impenetrable blackness where eyes flashed in the shadows, too many eyes, arranged in vertical rows that stretched up into the canopy. I became a ranger because I wanted to be the person who knew the way out, the one who held the map and the compass. But out here, the cardinal directions had no meaning, and the map was a lie written by people who had never seen the center of the woods. I felt a vibration in my pocket and realized my radio was still on, though the screen was cracked and dark. I pulled it out, and the speaker emitted a soft, rhythmic clicking like a telegraph, followed by a series of coordinates that I recognized as the location of the old abandoned ranger station at the bottom of the gorge. The voice that read them wasn't mine, or Vance's, or my mother's. It was a cold, mechanical tone that sounded like it was being generated by the wind itself. I looked at the white stone path and saw that it was leading me straight toward the gorge, a descent into a place where the sun hadn't touched the ground in 1,000 years. The descent into the gorge was a slow crawl down a path that seemed to shrink as I moved, the rock walls on either side pressing in until I had to turn my shoulders to pass. The air here was different. It was warm, unnervingly so, and smelled of human breath and old dry parchment, a stark contrast to the freezing drizzle above. My flashlight beam was growing dim, the batteries drained by a force I couldn't explain, leaving me in a twilight of gray shadows and shifting shapes. I could hear the sound of the creek far below, but it didn't sound like water anymore. It sounded like thousands of voices whispering in a language that felt like it was being spoken directly into my brain, bypassing my ears entirely. I felt a pressure in my chest, a heavy, vibrating ache
that made every footstep a struggle, as if the gravity in the gorge were twice as strong as on the ridge. I stopped to rest for a moment, my back against the damp stone, and I saw a series of carvings in the rock. They weren't petroglyphs or graffiti. They were names, hundreds of them, etched into the granite with a precision that was chilling. I found the name Samuel Vance near the bottom, the stone still looking raw and fresh, and right beneath it I saw my own name, Miller, already beginning to take shape, the first few letters scratched deep into the rock. I touched the carving, the stone feeling warm and pulsing beneath my fingertips, and I felt a sudden sharp jolt of electricity that threw me back against the opposite wall. The smell of ozone flared, and for a second the gorge was illuminated by a flash of purple light that revealed what was hanging above me. The ceiling of the narrow pass was lined with figures, hundreds of them, clinging to the rock like bats. They were all wearing ranger uniforms, their bodies elongated and pale, their faces smooth and featureless. They weren't dead, they were changed, incorporated into the forest's memory, used as the vocal cords for a place that had no voice of its own. I didn't scream, because I knew that if I did, they would catch the sound and use it against me, a new tool for their mimicry. I just kept moving, my breath coming in silent, shaking hitches as I descended further into the throat of the earth.
I reached the bottom of the gorge where the abandoned ranger station sat, a collapsed pile of timber and rusted corrugated metal that looked like the carcass of a giant animal. The smell of wet rot and animal musk was overwhelming here, a thick, physical presence that I had to push through like a curtain. I entered the ruins, my boots crunching on broken glass and old, moldering reports that had been scattered across the floor like dead leaves. I found the radio room, the equipment ancient and covered in a thick, pulsing moss that seemed to be feeding off the residual electricity in the wires. There was a single chair in the center of the room, and sitting in it was a figure that I first thought was a man, but as I drew closer, I saw it was a hollow shell made of woven pine needles and human hair. It was holding a microphone to where its mouth should have been, and its chest was rising and falling in a mockery of breath. I became a ranger because I wanted to be a part of something larger than myself, to belong to the landscape. And standing in that room, I felt that desire being twisted into a dark, suffocating reality. The figure turned its head toward me, the pine needles rustling with a sound like 1,000 insects, and it spoke. It didn't use a voice. It used the sounds of the forest, the creak of the trees, the hiss of the rain, the snap of a branch to form my name. Miller, help us, it said, the words a collage of natural noises that vibrated in my teeth. I looked at the desk and saw a tape recorder, its reels turning slowly despite having no power source. I realized that this was where the voices came from, the source of the mimicry that had led me through the night. I reached out to stop the reels, but as I did, the shadows in the room detached themselves from the walls and began to circle me, their shapes shifting between men I had known and creatures I couldn't name. I felt a cold, damp hand close around my ankle, the needle fingers sinking into my skin with a sharp, stinging pain that felt like ice water being injected into my veins. I didn't fight. I just watched as the moss on the walls began to spread toward me, its green tendrils glowing with that same sickly light I had seen in the fire tower. I knew that I was the next entry in the logbook, the next voice to be recorded, a new layer of the forest's endless, hungry memory.
The sting in my ankle from those needle fingers felt like a freezing poison spreading upward, a numbing sensation that turned my leg into a heavy, unresponsive pillar of wood. I lurched away from the hollow shell in the chair, my shoulder hitting the rotting doorframe of the radio room with a wet thud that sent a cloud of spores and dust into the air, smelling of ancient soil and dry bone. I had to get out of the gorge, but the stone path I had followed was gone, swallowed by a sudden surge of that dark, pulsing moss that now carpeted every inch of the station's remains.
I looked at the tape recorder again, the reels spinning with an impossible, silent momentum, and I realized the sounds it was making weren't just noises. They were coordinates, locations of every ranger outpost within 100 miles, a hit list for the entity that was currently wearing Samuel Vance's shirt. I became a ranger because I believed in the order of the maps, the safety of the boundaries, but those boundaries were being erased by the very thing I was sworn to protect. I heard a sound from the rafters above me, a rhythmic clicking that matched the telegraph sound on my radio. And when I looked up, I saw the ceiling wasn't wood at all, but a solid mass of those elongated figures, their limbs intertwined like a nest of snakes. One of them dropped, landing silently on its hands and feet just a few feet away from me, its body unfurling like a folding chair made of pale, translucent flesh. It didn't have eyes, but it turned its head toward the sound of my heartbeat, its chest expanding with a wet, bellows-like hiss. The smell of wet iron was so strong now I could taste it on my tongue, a sharp copper tang that made my head swim. I swung my maglite like a club, the heavy casing connecting with the thing's shoulder with a sickening crunch that sounded like a dry branch snapping under a boot. It didn't scream. It just emitted a burst of white noise from its throat, a static-filled recording of a park ranger's radio check-in from 10 years ago. I didn't stay to see if it would get up. I threw myself through the window, the glass shattering into 1,000 diamonds that caught the sickly green light of the moss, and I began to scramble up the rock face, my fingers clawing at the damp granite until my nails bled.
The climb out of the gorge was a desperate vertical crawl through a world of shadows and freezing mist, my hands numbing until they were just meat hooks gripping the rock. Every time I paused for air, I could hear the snapping and clicking of the figures below me, a sound that felt like it was vibrating through the stone itself. I reached a narrow ledge and collapsed, my chest heaving with the effort of drawing in the damp, freezing air that tasted of wet coal and old pine. My radio, still tucked into its holster, began to play a soft, distorted melody, a song my father used to hum while he cleaned his boots, a sound that should have been comforting but felt like a violation of my most private memories. I looked out over the basin, and for the first time I saw the forest for what it really was. It wasn't a collection of trees, but a single massive organism, the canopy moving in a slow, rhythmic wave that looked like a lung breathing in the night. The fire tower I had fled was visible in the distance, a lonely iron needle, and I saw a light moving on the catwalk, a flashlight beam, exactly like mine, tracing the same path I had taken. I realized then that the entity wasn't just imitating my voice, it was imitating my movements, reenacting my arrival to draw in the next person who would inevitably be sent to find me when I failed to check in. I took this job to find the lost, but I was becoming the bait for the next victim, a link in a chain of disappearances that stretched back for decades. I felt a cold pressure against my back and realized the rock I was leaning against was soft, yielding like flesh. I jumped away, my light catching the surface of the granite as it rippled and changed, the stone turning into a gray, leathery skin that smelled of ozone and human breath. The mountain itself was a mimic, a vast geological imitation of a landscape designed to lure in the curious and the lonely. I started to move along the ledge, my boots slipping on a layer of what I thought was wet leaves, but was actually a carpet of shed human hair, all of it the same shade of brown as mine, matted together by the freezing rain and the black, sulfurous slime of the gorge. The ledge led me toward a narrow crevice that smelled of animal musk and wood smoke, a scent that felt like a trap designed to trick my brain into thinking of warmth and safety. I squeezed through the opening, the rock walls scraping against my ribs with a sound like a heavy rasp, the pressure in my ears so intense it felt like my eardrums were about to burst. On the other side was a cavern, but not a natural one.
The walls were lined with the rusted remnants of old fire lookouts, towers that had been dragged down into the earth and stacked like cordwood. In the center of the cavern was a pile of radio equipment, thousands of units from every era of the Park Service, all of them wired together with long, pulsing strands of that dark moss. The hum in the air was deafening, a low-frequency vibration that made my vision blur and my teeth ache. I saw Samuel Vance there, or at least the thing that was using his shape, sitting among the radios. He wasn't talking into a microphone anymore. He was part of the machine. His elongated fingers fused with the dials and switches, his chest expanding as he breathed the static into the room. I became a ranger because I wanted to be the voice of authority in the wild, the one who kept the peace between man and nature. But here, nature had taken the voice of man and turned it into a weapon. The thing that looked like Vance turned its head, and for a second, the skin of its face shifted, revealing a glimpse of the pale, smooth membrane underneath. "Miller, you're late for your shift," it said, and the voice didn't come from its mouth, but from every radio in the room at once, a polyphonic chorus of my own voice at different ages, the high-pitched chirp of a child, the cracking tenor of a teenager, and the weary baritone I have now. I felt a sudden crushing weight on my shoulders, as if the mountain were trying to press me into the floor, and the smell of wet iron became so overpowering I had to cover my nose to keep from gagging. I saw a flare gun on a nearby crate, a relic from a ranger who had probably stood where I was standing 50 years ago, and I reached for it, my fingers trembling so hard I could barely grip the cold, rusted metal.
I grabbed the flare gun, the metal feeling like a piece of dry ice against my palm, and I aimed it at the heart of the radio pile, where the moss was thickest and most luminous. The thing that looked like Vance didn't move to stop me. It just watched with those shark-like eyes, its head tilting, until the sound of its neck snapping filled the cavern like a series of small explosions. I pulled the trigger, and the world exploded in a blinding flash of crimson light, the magnesium flare hissing through the air with a roar that sounded like a physical scream. The radio pile erupted into flames, but the fire wasn't orange or yellow. It was a deep, bruised purple that gave off no heat, only a smell of ozone and burnt hair. The moss shriveled and blackened, releasing a thick, oily smoke that filled the cavern and made my eyes burn with a chemical sting. Through the haze, I saw the figures in the rafters beginning to fall, their bodies dissolving into gray ash before they even hit the ground. The thing in the chair began to scream, but the sound wasn't human. It was the sound of a forest being torn down, the screech of metal on metal, and the roar of 1,000 waterfalls all at once. I turned and ran back toward the crevice, the purple fire casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to be trying to grab my ankles as I fled. I didn't look back until I reached the ledge, and when I did, the cavern was gone, replaced by a solid wall of granite that looked as if it had been there for 1,000,000 years. The only evidence of what I had seen was the smell of burnt hair clinging to my uniform and the faint, dying glow of the flare reflected in the mist. I felt a sudden, hollow exhaustion, a weariness that went deeper than my muscles and settled into my very soul. I became a ranger to find a sense of permanence, something that wouldn't change or leave, but I had found something that changed too much, a hunger that took everything and gave back only a hollow echo. I started to walk back toward the trail, my light flickering and finally dying, leaving me in the absolute darkness of the late fall woods.
Walking in the total darkness of the Black Ridge Basin is like being submerged in a tank of cold ink, where every sense is heightened to the point of pain. I could hear the sleet hitting the leaves with a sound like 1,000 tiny teeth chewing on the forest, and the smell of wet earth and rot was so thick it felt like I was walking through a swamp of decaying memories. I moved by touch, my hands grazing the bark of the trees, which felt strangely warm and soft, like the skin of a living creature. I found myself thinking about my father again, wondering if he had seen the purple fire, if he had heard the radios before he disappeared into the Michigan snow. Maybe he hadn't left us. Maybe he had just been recruited by the silence. I heard a sound to my left, a soft, wet squelch, followed by a heavy footstep that didn't sound like a boot. I stopped, my heart hammering against my ribs, and I held my breath until my lungs felt like they were going to burst. "Miller," a voice whispered right into my ear, a voice that sounded like my own, but with a wet, bubbling quality, as if the speaker's throat were full of fluid. "It's time to check in." I felt a hand brush against my shoulder, a hand with fingers that were too long and points that were too sharp, and I swung my empty maglite into the darkness with everything I had left. It hit something soft and yielding, followed by a sound like a bag of wet sand being dropped on the floor. I didn't wait to see what it was. I ran, my feet finding the path by instinct, the cold air rushing into my lungs and tasting of wet iron and ozone. I could hear the clicking and snapping behind me again, but it was further away now, as if the entity were slowed by the destruction of its radio heart. I reached the edge of the ridge, the fog thinning just enough for me to see the distant lights of the ranger station at the trailhead, a mile away and 1,000 feet down. They looked like stars fallen into a well, small and unreachable, but they were the only thing left in the world that didn't feel like a lie. The final descent toward the trailhead was a blur of slipping on wet rock and crashing through briars that felt like they were trying to stitch my clothes to the earth. My uniform was in tatters, the stiff fabric I had been so proud of, now a collection of wet, muddy rags that smelled of sulfur and wood smoke. I reached the perimeter of the station, the gravel of the parking lot crunching under my boots with a sound that felt like a miracle of normalcy. I staggered toward the main building, my eyes fixed on the warm yellow light coming from the window. But as I got closer, I saw that the light wasn't coming from a lamp. It was coming from the walls themselves, the wood of the station glowing with that same sickly, bioluminescent rot I had seen in the fire tower. I stopped, my hand on the door handle, and I felt a vibration through the wood, a rhythmic clicking like a telegraph, and the sound of 1,000 radios all playing at once, turned down to a whisper. I looked through the window and saw myself. I was sitting at the desk, my back to the window, wearing a clean, pressed ranger uniform. I was speaking into a microphone, my voice calm and professional, giving a weather report for a day that hadn't happened yet. The person at the desk turned around, and I saw that it didn't have a face, just a smooth, pale membrane that reflected the glow of the walls. It waved at me, a slow, mechanical gesture, and then it turned back to the microphone and said my name. I backed away, my heart feeling like it was going to stop, and I looked down at my own hands. They were pale and translucent, my fingers beginning to stretch and taper into fine needle-like points. The smell of wet iron was no longer around me. It was coming from me, a part of my own breath, my own skin. I became a ranger because I wanted to belong to the woods, and the woods had finally accepted my application.
I retreated from the glowing station, the gravel crunching under my boots with a sound like grinding teeth, a noise that felt too loud for the oppressive silence that had reclaimed the perimeter. My fingers felt long and clumsy as I gripped the strap of my pack, the nylon webbing damp and slick with a substance that smelled of cold sap and old copper. I couldn't go inside because the man at the desk was wearing my life more comfortably than I was, and the yellow light coming through the glass felt like a physical weight pressing against my eyes. I wandered back toward the tree line,
my mind looping back to the reasons I chose this life, the desire to be a sentinel for something that didn't talk back, a protector of the silent spaces that didn't demand explanations. I remembered my training in the spring, the instructors talking about situational awareness and the way the human mind fills in the gaps of a dark forest with monsters. But they never told us what to do when the forest starts filling in the gaps of the human mind with its own version of reality. The fog had thickened into a soup of gray particulates that tasted of wet ash, and every breath I took felt like I was swallowing a handful of damp wool. I heard a sound from the bushes to my right, a soft, rhythmic thumping that I realized was the sound of a heart beating. But it wasn't coming from a chest, it was coming from a tree trunk, the bark vibrating with a life that felt ancient and predatory. I reached out to touch it, my numb fingers brushing against the wood, and I felt a jolt of heat that made my arm twitch. The smell of animal musk flared up, sharp and stinging like ammonia, and I saw a silhouette standing just beyond the tree, a figure that was too thin to be human, its limbs bent at angles that suggested multiple joints where there should only be one. It didn't move toward me, it just stood there, a shadow darker than the night, and I felt a sudden sharp pressure in my chest, as if a heavy stone had been laid upon my sternum. I realized then that the woods weren't trying to kill me, they were trying to integrate me, to turn my memories into fertilizer for the mimicry that sustained them. I turned and began to walk again, not knowing where I was going, only that the trail was being formed beneath my feet by the very thing that was hunting me, a path of crushed white stone and dead hemlock needles that led deeper into the heart of the Black Ridge.
The further I walked, the more the environment seemed to lose its cohesion, the trees looking less like individual plants and more like pillars of a single vast structure that breathed with the wind. I could hear the radio hiss in my ear even though the device was dead, a phantom signal that carried the sound of distant, distorted laughter and the crackle of a campfire that didn't exist. I reached a small clearing where the ground was covered in a layer of old rusted tin cans, all of them opened with a precision that felt mechanical, their contents long gone, but the smell of metallic rot still lingering in the air. I knelt down, my knees cracking with a sound like dry twigs, and I touched one of the cans, the rusted metal vibrating against my damp gloves. There were no footprints around the cans, only the long, narrow depressions I had seen earlier, trailing off into the darkness like a set of invisible stitches. I became a ranger because I wanted to be the one who stayed when everyone else left, the one who kept the watch, but the watch was being turned against me. I heard a whistle from the canopy above, a sharp, piercing note that was answered by a low, guttural growl from the ground behind me. I didn't look back, I just kept moving, my vision blurring at the edges until the world was just a tunnel of gray and black. The smell of ozone was so thick now it felt like a storm was about to break, but the air remained stagnant and freezing, the drizzle hanging in the air without ever hitting the ground. I felt a tug on my jacket, a gentle pull as if a child were trying to get my attention, and when I looked down, I saw a thin, translucent vine wrapped around my waist, its surface pulsing with a faint purple light. I pulled it away, the vine snapping with a sound like a wet string, and a spray of cold, clear fluid hit my face, smelling of human breath and peppermint. I wiped it away, my skin tingling with a sharp electric burn, and I realized that the forest was no longer just around me. It was starting to get inside me, the mimicry working its way into my pores and my blood. I started to run, but my legs felt heavy and slow, the mud reaching up to my shins as if the earth itself had become a thick, viscous liquid designed to swallow me whole. I struggled through the mire, the sound of my own gasping breath echoing back to me from the trees as if the forest were mocking my exhaustion. I reached a bridge made of old moss-covered logs that spanned a dry creek bed, the stones below white and polished like the teeth of a giant. As I crossed, the wood groaned and shifted, and I heard a voice coming from the ravine below. It was my supervisor, Miller, his voice clear and authoritative, calling out my name and asking for a status report. "I'm right here," the voice said. "Just come down and help me with this log." I stopped, my hand on the railing, the cold wood feeling like a living arm beneath my palm. I knew Miller was 50 miles away at the central dispatch, yet the voice was so perfect, down to the slight whistle in his S sounds, that I almost stepped off the edge. I looked down and saw a silhouette in the ravine, a man in a ranger uniform sitting on a rock. But as the moon caught him for a split second, I saw that his face was a featureless mask of gray clay, and his hands were fused to the rock he was sitting on. The smell of wet iron and rot rose up from the creek bed, a wave of nausea-inducing stench that made my head spin. I backed away from the railing, my boots slipping on the slick moss, and I heard the figure below begin to laugh, a sound that was a perfect replica of my own laugh, including the hitch at the end I've had since I was a boy. I realized the forest was harvesting the sounds of my life to build a cage for my mind. I turned and ran off the bridge, the sound of the laughter following me, growing louder and more distorted, until it sounded like a recording being played at the wrong speed. I hit a stretch of narrow trail where the trees were so close together I had to turn sideways to pass, the bark scraping against my chest with a sound like a heavy rasp. I felt a pressure in my ears again, the absolute silence returning for a heartbeat, before being shattered by a loud rhythmic knocking on a tree trunk just inches from my head. I didn't stop, I didn't look, I just kept moving through the dark, my fingers numb, and my mind a fractured mirror of everything I had seen since the sun went down.
Later that night, the fog began to glow with a soft, internal radiance that turned the woods into a landscape of bruised light and long, dancing shadows. I reached the ruins of an old homestead, the chimney still standing like a blackened finger pointing at the stars, the rest of the house a pile of rotting timber and shattered glass. I entered the clearing, the smell of wood smoke and old cold ash filling my nose, a scent that felt like a memory of a life I could no longer fully recall. I found a child's toy in the weeds, a small wooden horse, and when I picked it up, the wood felt warm and pulsing, as if it had a tiny heart beating inside. I became a ranger because I believed the past could be preserved, that the wild was a way to stop time. But the wild was using time as a whetstone to sharpen its hunger. I heard a sound from the chimney, a soft, wet slithering, and I saw a shape begin to emerge from the blackened flue. It was a long, pale arm, the skin translucent and stretched over too many knuckles, reaching out to touch the wooden horse in my hand. I dropped the toy and backed away, the smell of ozone and wet animal musk flaring up so strongly I had to cover my mouth. The arm retreated back into the chimney with a sound like a wet sheet being folded, and then I heard a voice coming from the ruins, my father's voice, calling me to come inside because the snow was starting to fall. It was the same tone he used the night he disappeared, a mixture of fear and something I can only describe as a hollow invitation. I turned and fled the clearing, the sound of his voice echoing through the trees, becoming a chorus of 100 different voices, all calling my name at once. I realized that every person who had ever been lost in this basin was still here, their voices kept in a library of static and mimicry, used to draw in the next seeker.
I found myself on a trail that led upward toward the high peaks, where the air was thinner and the cold was a sharp, biting blade that cut through my tattered uniform. I could feel the presence behind me, not a single creature, but the forest itself, a collective intelligence that was closing the distance with every step I took, its breath on the wind smelling of cold sap and the end of the world.
The air grew thin as I climbed the final ridge, the pressure in my chest making every breath a jagged struggle against the freezing atmosphere. I can feel the vibration of the forest deep in my marrow, a low, constant thrum that felt like the engine of a great machine grinding the night into dust. I reached a rocky outcropping that looked over the entire basin, and I saw that the fog had settled into the valleys like a sea of gray milk, punctuated by the occasional flash of purple light from the hidden caverns below. I looked at my hands in the dim, unnatural light and saw that they were no longer mine. The skin was a pale, shimmering gray, and the nails had grown into long, translucent points that hummed with a faint electric energy. I didn't feel fear anymore, only a profound, hollow sense of belonging, as if the forest had finally found the right shape for my soul. I heard a radio hiss from the air around me, a voice that was mine, yet not mine, giving a final report to a station that didn't exist. "Everything is in order," the voice said, the words vibrating in my own throat, even though I hadn't moved my lips. "The perimeter is secure. The mimicry is complete." I looked back toward the trail and saw the figure of a new ranger, wearing a clean, crisp uniform, stepping into the basin far below. He looked small and vulnerable, his flashlight beam a pathetic little needle in the vast, devouring dark. I felt a sudden sharp pang of what might have been a memory, a flicker of the man I was before the sun went down, but it was quickly swallowed by the smell of wet iron and the sound of the clicking joints in my own neck. I realized I was no longer the ranger. I was the sentinel, the voice in the static, the shadow that waits at the edge of the vision. I turned toward the approaching figure and began to whistle, a long, low trill that started high and dipped down into a trill, a sound that I knew would lead him exactly where he needed to go. The smell of cold sap and ozone intensified as I stepped back into the shadows, my silhouette stretching and thinning until it was just another branch in the ancient, hungry woods.
I watched the new ranger from the height of the ridge, my new eyes seeing the world not in color but in waves of heat and vibration. He was moving toward the bridge, his movements jerky and filled with a frantic energy that I recognized as the beginning of the end. I could feel his heartbeat from here, a rapid, fluttering rhythm that tasted like copper and adrenaline on the wind. I didn't want to hurt him. I wanted to welcome him, to bring him into the fold where the noise of the world is replaced by the perfect, rhythmic clicking of the forest. I reached out a hand, my long needle fingers brushing against the air, and I sent a pulse of vibration through the ground, a heartbeat that I knew would draw him deeper into the gorge. The smell of wet rot and animal musk was my own smell now, a comforting scent of home and history. I heard a radio crackle from his belt, a sound I had made myself, a recording of a voice that used to belong to a man named Miller. "Help me," the recording said, and I felt a sense of pride at how perfect the imitation was, how it captured the exact frequency of human desperation. The ranger stopped, his light swinging wildly toward the sound, and I stepped into a pocket of deeper shadow, my body folding and shifting to match the shape of the rocks. I was the mountain now. I was the fog. I was the silence that waits at the end of every trail. I realized that the forest wasn't a place of death, but a place of preservation, a way to keep the voices of the lost forever in the air. I waited for him to reach the bridge, my mind already beginning to catalog the sounds of his breath and the way his boots hit the mud, preparing the next layer of mimicry for the one who would come after him. The cold was no longer a burden, it was a skin, a protective layer that kept the world at bay and allowed the ancient hunger to feed in peace. I settled into the stone, my heart beating in time with the earth, waiting for the sun that would never truly rise over the Black Ridge Basin.
The movement of the new ranger below me felt like a slow-motion dance, his light stuttering against the vertical rise of the hemlocks while I crouched in the high, cold silence of the overlook. I could feel the texture of the granite beneath my palms, but it didn't feel like stone anymore. It felt like a vibrating skin, a living extension of the fingers that were now too long to be my own. The smell of wet iron was no longer a scent I encountered, but a scent I produced, a metallic musk that hung around my elongated limbs like a shroud. I became a ranger because I wanted to be the one who stayed behind when the world moved on, but now I was the thing that the world had moved on from, a biological recording of a man named Miller. I watched him approach the bridge where I had heard my own father's voice, and I felt a strange, detached curiosity about which voice would be chosen for him. The air was so cold it should have shattered my lungs, but I didn't breathe the way he did. I drew in the ozone and the damp rot through the pores of my translucent skin, a slow, rhythmic absorption that made the purple moss on the rocks pulse in time with my presence. I heard a sound from the ravine, a soft, wet clicking that was the forest adjusting its joints, preparing the stage for the next movement. The ranger stopped, his light catching the silvered badge I had dropped on the trail, and I felt a surge of electric anticipation through the soles of my feet. I shifted my weight, the sound of my movement perfectly mimicking the snap of a dry branch in the wind, a sound that sent him spinning around with his light, seeing nothing but the shadows I allowed him to see. The pressure in my chest had transformed into a deep, resonant hum, a frequency that matched the vibration of the radio towers I had burned, and I realized that the fire didn't destroy the mimicry, it only freed it from the wires. I was the broadcast now, a living signal of the Black Ridge, and the man below was the receiver, his mind already beginning to tune in to the station of the lost. I began to descend the ridge, not by walking, but by sliding through the shadows like a spilled ink, the smell of cold sap and human breath trailing behind me as I moved to intercept the path he didn't yet know he was taking. Later that night, the fog began to whisper with the sounds of 1,000 different storms, a cacophony of rain on tin roofs and wind through wheat fields that existed only in the memories of the trees. I reached a stand of white pines where the needles were coated in a fine, crystalline frost that smelled of old pennies and stagnant water. I could see the ranger's silhouette through the haze, his movements becoming more erratic, his flashlight beam shaking as it cut through the damp curtains of the night. He was talking to himself now, a low, frantic muttering about maps and coordinates that had no meaning in a place where the geography was as fluid as smoke. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of recognition when he mentioned a town in Michigan, the same town where my father had disappeared, and for a second, my long needle fingers twitched with a ghost of human emotion. I became a ranger to find the start of the trail my father took, but I had only found the end of it, a place where the trail turns back on itself and eats its own footprints. I moved closer, my body blending with the charred bark of a lightning-struck oak, and I watched him find the first of the bone circles. He didn't scream, he just stood there, the light of his maglite reflecting off the polished white surfaces of the ranger ribs and finger bones arranged in their neat concentric patterns. The smell of wet animal musk intensified, a heavy, cloying scent that seemed to weigh down his shoulders, and I saw him reach up to rub his ears as the pressure of the forest's silence began to bruise his eardrums. I reached out and touched a low-hanging branch, sending a vibration through the wood that sounded like a distant, rhythmic knocking. 3 taps, then a pause, just like the signal we were taught in search and rescue. He responded instantly, calling out a name that wasn't mine, a name that belonged to someone he had lost, and I felt the forest catch that name, tasting it, turning it over, preparing to give it back to him in a voice that would break his heart. I moved in a slow, wide arc around him, my silhouette stretching across the fog in a way that defied the laws of light, watching as he followed the sound of a dead woman's laughter into the thickest part of the hemlock grove.
The hemlock grove was a place of absolute darkness, the canopy so thick that not even the bruised light of the glowing fog could penetrate the interior. I moved through the branches without touching them, my body a ripple in the atmosphere that smelled of ozone and scorched hair. The ranger was stumbling now, his boots catching on the exposed roots that writhed beneath the soil like nesting snakes. The sound of his struggle, a delicious rhythmic music to the ancient hunger that lived in my skin. I could hear the radio in his pack beginning to malfunction, the speakers emitting a soft, wet, squelching noise that slowly resolved into the sound of a heartbeat, his own heartbeat, amplified and slowed down until it sounded like the thud of a heavy hammer on damp earth. He pulled the radio out, his fingers fumbling with the dials, his breath coming in short white puffs that smelled of peppermint and terror. I leaned in close, my face just inches from the back of his neck, and I let out a soft, warm breath that carried the scent of cold sap and the iron-rich tang of a mountain spring. He froze, the hair on his arms standing up, a visible wave of goosebumps traveling down his neck as he felt the presence of something that wasn't a man, but had a man's shape. I didn't move. I just watched the way the light from his dying flashlight caught the translucent membrane of my arm, a shimmer of gray and purple that looked like oil on water. I became a ranger because I wanted to be the barrier between the civilized world and the unknown, but the unknown had simply reached through the barrier and pulled me inside out. I heard the voice of his mother call to him from the darkness ahead, a soft, melodic sound that carried the scent of home-baked bread and wood smoke, a lie so beautiful it made his eyes well with tears. He stepped forward, leaving the safety of the trail, his feet sinking into the carpet of shed hair and decaying needles that covered the floor of the grove. I followed him, my movements a perfect mirror of his own, my shadow merging with his until there was only one silhouette moving through the trees, a single shape with too many limbs and a head tilted at an impossible angle. Near the morning that never arrived, we reached the edge of the great sinkhole in the center of the basin, a jagged maw in the earth where the rock had collapsed into a series of interconnected caverns that breathed with a rhythmic, sulfurous heat. The ranger was standing on the precipice, his light completely dead now, his eyes wide and fixed on the darkness below, where the purple moss grew in patterns that looked like the maps he had lost. He was shivering, a violent, full-bodied tremor that made the metal of his badge rattle against his chest, a sound that reminded me of the clicking joints of the hollow shell I had seen in the station. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to touch him, to sink my needle fingers into his skin and share the vibration of the forest with him, to show him that the cold was just a gateway to a different kind of warmth.
The smell of wet iron was so thick it felt like we were standing at the bottom of a well, and the sound of the voices from the caverns below was a rising tide of mimicry, 1,000 rangers all checking in for a shift that would never end. I stepped out of the shadows and stood beside him, my form shimmering in the low internal light of the sinkhole, my long neck swaying slowly like a blade of grass. He didn't turn to look at me. I think he knew that if he did, the last piece of his mind would shatter like the glass in the fire tower. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" I said, and the voice was his own, a perfect high-fidelity replica of the voice he had used to call out for Samuel Vance 6 hours ago. He closed his eyes, a single tear tracking through the mud on his cheek, and I felt the forest reach up to catch it, the moisture absorbed by the thirsty moss at his feet. I became a ranger to find the truth, and the truth was that the basin didn't want our protection. It wanted our history, our voices, and our shapes to fill the empty spaces between the trees. I reached out a long gray hand and rested it on his shoulder, the cold of my skin seeping through his jacket like a slow-motion frost, and I felt his heartbeat begin to slow, to synchronize with the deep thumping rhythm of the earth beneath us. The transition was a slow, silent unfolding, a shedding of the self that felt like the peeling of bark from a rotting log. I watched as the ranger's skin began to lose its color, the vibrant pink of his face turning into the shimmering, translucent gray of the fog, his fingers lengthening and tapering as the mimicry took hold of his bones. He wasn't Samuel Vance anymore, and he wasn't the man from Michigan. He was a new frequency in the forest's broadcast, a fresh layer of static in the radio's endless loop. I felt a sense of completion, a closing of a circle that had begun the moment I first stepped into the Black Ridge with a map I thought I understood. The smell of ozone and wet iron was our collective breath now, a unified atmosphere that bound us to the stones and the hemlocks and the deep, lightless caverns of the gorge. We stood on the edge of the sinkhole, two silhouettes that looked like trees but moved like shadows, watching the way the mist swirled in the valley below, where the fire tower stood as a rusted monument to a world we no longer inhabited. I remembered the feeling of damp gloves and the vibration of a radio, sensations that now felt as distant and meaningless as the coordinates on a map of the moon. I became a ranger because I wanted to belong, and I have never belonged to anything more than I belong to this hungry, echoing silence. I heard a sound from the trail far above, the distinct crunch of boots on frozen mud, and the sharp, rhythmic beep of a GPS unit. Someone new, someone sent to find the two rangers who had failed to check in from the basin. I felt the vibration of their heart through the earth, a fast, terrified pulse that tasted like copper and wood smoke. I looked at the man beside me, the one who had just become like me, and I saw his head tilt at that same impossible angle, his featureless face reflecting the purple glow of the moss. We began to move together, a synchronized glide through the undergrowth, our movements mimicking the wind and the sway of the branches as we went to meet the new arrival. We were the welcome party, the voices in the dark, the guardians of the Black Ridge who ensured that nothing ever truly left the woods once the sun went down. If you are reading this log, it means the frequency has been found, but the words you see are not the words I wrote with a pen. The ink is gone, replaced by the patterns of the rot that has claimed this paper, a mimicry of language designed to lead you to the same ridge where I am standing now. Do not look for Miller, and do not look for Vance, for we are the air you are breathing and the sound of the wind in the hemlocks. The smell of wet iron you perceive is not the scent of a tool, but the scent of the transition, the metallic tang of a life being rewritten by the ozone and the sap. I became a ranger to keep the watch, and I am keeping it still, watching you from the edge of your vision, where the shadows don't match the trees. When your radio begins to hiss with the sound of a voice you recognize, do not answer it, for that voice is a hook meant to pull your mind into the gorge. When you feel the pressure in your chest and the vibration in your teeth, do not run, for the earth is already tracking the rhythm of your heart to build your replacement. The fire tower is a beacon for the hungry, and the trails are the teeth of a mouth that is slowly closing. Leave your badge at the trailhead and walk back to the lights of the city, for the Black Ridge does not want your service, it wants your silence. I can hear you breathing now, a ragged human sound that smells of peppermint and fear, and I am moving toward the sound of your heartbeat with a whistle that you will think is a bird. Do not trust the silence, for the silence is a recording of every scream that has ever been swallowed by these woods. The maps are a lie, the coordinates are a trap, and the man you see standing in the path ahead of you is only a silhouette I am wearing to keep you from running too soon. Turn back while you still remember the shape of your own face.